Wonderful to see all of you today. It's been an extraordinary weekend, and I know some of you have been with us throughout. One of the, I'm going to call him principal architects of these 3 years of adult learning and this exploration of our relationship with Israel as both people and place has been Steve Subrin. And so it's a pleasure to invite you forward, Steve, to introduce Daniel Kurtzer.
When I was a teenager in Akron, Ohio, and got my driver's license, there was a 2-mile stretch where you didn't have to take the major highway. It was kind of like a country road. Having just gotten my license to drive, I tested the outer limits of my dad's car. You'd go 80, 85, and there weren't a lot of people around. Well, my older brother got wind of that, and he gave me a little speech. He said, Steve, I heard what you're doing, and, if anything bad happens, you can't undo it. That you can really hurt other people, that's irreparable, and let alone what you can do to yourself. Hearing our Scholar-in-Residence last year and this year is very convincing to me that we're at a place in history that after 2.5 millennium of getting a Jewish homeland, it is in extreme danger. And, I think to myself, when I was 77, what do I think about that I haven't done? And the two things that come to mind that seem to me just unbelievably dangerous are global warming and the state of Israel. And thinking of waking up with it either a pariah state or a state in perpetual warfare or a state exercising apartheid is so painful, and one wonders what one can do about it. Sitting on the table over there are a whole bunch of these. We've really tried for the last year to give you lots of ways that you can engage personally with this issue. You can go to Israel with Rabbi Morrison, you can go to Prague and London, you could join one of 2 active groups working on the problem. There are lectures. So think about it, that, this may be a unique time in world Jewish history that it calls out for all of us who can do anything to step up and do it. We've been blessed last year and this year with a gentleman who has spent his adult life trying to make progress on Israel-Palestinian relationships. Daniel Kurtzer holds the S. Daniel Abraham Chair in Middle East Policy Studies at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton. He has been ambassador in Egypt and Israel. He's been active in many groups at both a governmental level and otherwise on Middle East issues. He has co-written books about the problem, and those of you who have been with us this weekend know his career and what he's tried to do to avoid this train wreck has been phenomenal. So we welcome him the last time this weekend. I was talking last night whether we could set up a retainer with him so that every year he'll join us. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Kurtzer.
I thanked Steve yesterday for assuring me that the invitation to return this year was not to correct the mistakes made last year. But I now want to assure Steve that if invited back, I will give him some cause for optimism about the future of Israel and hopefully the future of the peace process. For those of you who actually consulted the calendar this morning, it's October 6th, which is the 40th anniversary of the invasion of Israel by Egypt and Syria in 1973 at the start of what became known as the Yom Kippur War. A war that in many respects represented both the concluding chapter in one phase of Middle Eastern history and the opening of several critically important chapters, which in many respects we are seeing both their having reached fruition today and perhaps leading us to think about what the next chapter holds. And so there's perhaps no better way to frame our discussion of the contemporary challenges that the United States faces in the Middle East and that Middle Eastern states face themselves than by looking at what this set of issues since 1973 has ushered in, and whether or not we in fact are seeing what I think is the end of one era and the beginning of something that might yet unfold as a quite different way of looking at the Middle East. In one respect, 73 represented the end of the 1967 war. We tended to call 67 the 6 Days War, but it actually was a 6-year war. Right after that war ended, 6 days after it started, Palestinian terrorism began, both in the West Bank and Gaza, and then when Israel chased the guerrillas, the terrorists, from the territories, that terrorism moved to Jordan and then to Lebanon and ultimately, as we know, to Tunisia, where the PLO was based until 1993. It also marked the beginning of what became known as the War of Attrition, a 3-year effort by Egypt to remind Israel that Egypt would not tolerate the occupation of its territory, and in so doing, changed the strategic situation on the ground in rather fundamental ways. It's one of the most interesting periods in which I teach at Princeton because you can see the seeds of the 1973 war being planted at almost every turn during this period. And while nothing in life is inevitable, one of the themes that I've tried to suggest this weekend, as we look back, there seemed to have been an inevitability to 73 that we should have been able to see unfold during that 6-year period. So on the one hand, 73 ended a chapter of warfare, but it also ushered in a number of rather significant developments which began to unfold in the period after 73. First of all, it is the serious beginning of what we now call the peace process. And in fact, it was during the Kissinger shuttles right after the 73 war that that term was invented as it applies to the Middle East. They had been calling this Middle East negotiations, and Kissinger told his team at the time, it's now, you can read this in documents that have been unclassified, that he saw this peace effort as something more than negotiations. It was a broader process which needed to unfold, involving not just interactions between governments, but also interactions between peoples, between societies. It was not only the beginning of the peace process, but it was also the re-entry onto center stage of that peace process of the Palestinians, who had never really gone away, but who were not central players, central actors in this drama after 1948, after the defeat in what they called the Nakba, the disaster of 1948, and the dispersion of their leadership and of the refugee population. After 48 and essentially until 73, what had been an internal conflict in Palestine for sovereignty over a territory that both Zionism and Palestinian nationalism claimed, after 1948 became an interstate problem. Israel and Arab states vying for political power and political influence. What 73, however, did was to bring the Palestinians back onto center stage. And you remember this was the period in which the United Nations declared the Palestine Liberation Organization to be the, quote, sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. A couple of years later, it was the period in which the Palestinians were able to maneuver at the United Nations to declare Zionism as a form of racism. This was a period of intense Palestinian international terrorism, the Munich Olympics, 1972, but the hijackings and the attacks that were suffered around the world. In other words, Palestinians who had largely been marginalized as an agent in their own history were now resuming their place in this conflict between them and Israel. It was a period after 73 of the emergence of at least potential Arab power in the form, in the first instance, of an oil embargo. You remember that, the long lines that we suffered here. But much more significant than our discomfort was the fact that the Arabs had come to realize that they had a weapon at their disposal which they could use, in this case, to further the aims of Arab politics, of Palestinian politics. It was not the absolute beginning, but it was, in some respects, the beginning of the demise of Soviet influence. Now, in a sense, this was a long and slow demise. It had begun a year earlier when Anwar Sadat had kicked the Soviet military advisors, 17,000 of them. He had kicked them out of Egypt, which represented a significant turn in Soviet strategic thinking. But after 73, the Soviets became marginalized in what had previously been an area of U.S.-Soviet competition and rivalry. The United States not only had the relationship that it had begun to establish with Israel, but also had now begun to establish a relationship with the most significant Arab country, with Egypt, a relationship that was to burgeon over the years into what's now a 35-year strategic relationship between the United States and Egypt. It was also a period after 73 marked by the beginning of Islamism as a real phenomenon in the Middle East. And within 10 years, we were to see this proliferation of the Islamist trend. By the end of that decade, 1979, you had the Iranian Revolution overthrowing the Shah. As a result, largely, of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, you had the rise of an Islamist opposition which morphed into al-Qaeda. You had, as a result, largely of Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1978 and a combination of internal Lebanese factors, the rise of Hezbollah as a factor in Middle East politics. And you had in the occupied territories, starting in the early 1980s and mushrooming into a grown phenomenon by the end of that decade, the growth of Hamas. And what this represented was a substitution of what had been the organizing principle in this region of Arab state politics into an alternative organizing principle of Islamist politics, much of which we're still living with today. You also had both the high point in 73 and then the cliff off which the Arab state system collapsed. It was the high point because what Egypt and Syria proved in 73 is that despite the analysis that both the United States and Israel shared, that Arab states could not and therefore would not wage war with Israel. You remember this was called in the Agranat Commission after the 73 war in Israel, it was called the concept, where the Israeli military assessed before the war that Egypt and Syria had the capability to fight, but they didn't have the will and therefore would not fight. And so in a sense, the war represented a high point in the Arab system because the Arabs translated a capability that they were recognized to have into a reality which they exercised and changed the situation on the ground. But almost immediately, you saw a significant and precipitous downward slide in what we came to know over the years as this Arab state system. The weakness of Egypt and Syria and Iraq, the three pillars of Arab politics over the centuries, not just in our day, became almost irrelevant. And what replaced those three pillars over the course of the next decades were a number of different phenomena. Number one, the rise to prominence of powers on the periphery of the Middle East. Turkey, Iran, a Muslim but not an Arab country, and Israel, who continued to dominate the politics of this region far more than Arab states dominate the politics of this region. You saw the rise of non-state actors. Consider that since 1973, there have been a number of Arab-Israeli wars. Not one of them has been at its center a war between Israel and an Arab state. They have all been wars between Israel and non-state actors. Israel and the PLO in the war in Lebanon, Israel and whatever you want to call it, the National Guidance Committee of the First Intifada, in other words, local Palestinians together with Hamas, Israel and Hamas several times in this decade, the past decade, and Israel and Hezbollah fighting in Lebanon. Arab states have sometimes been drawn into the fray, but as primary actors, they have now given way to the role of non-state actors, another sign of the weakness of the Arab state system. And as noted, it's been the period of a rise of Islamist politics everywhere. And one could make the argument, which I'm not going to make today, but I'll put it out there as a headline in case you want to talk about it during the question and answer period. I might even expand this not just to Islamist politics, but to fundamentalist politics, given what's happening in the state of Israel and the rise to prominence over the years of parties that can be described only in terms of fundamentalism with regard to their religious beliefs playing into the political system, whether it's Shas, which plays a very active role in Israeli politics, or Agudat Yisrael, which still will not serve in ministerial positions, but plays a very powerful role in the Knesset and in finance matters, and of course the role of fundamentalist rabbis in the West Bank who are also political leaders of the settlements movement. So it's not just a phenomenon that we've seen grow in the Arab and Muslim world, but a phenomenon we've seen more broadly in the Middle East. And so these processes that began to unfold and perhaps in some respects were launched or at least catalyzed by the 1973 war, in many respects governed the degree to which this region played its role in international politics over the past 40 years. And therefore also largely determined the way in which the United States interacted with this region over the last 40 years. Friday night, I spoke about the United States' role in the peace process, a role which we activated seriously in the immediate aftermath of 1973 with the Kissinger shuttles. Kissinger brought about 3 agreements, 2 with Egypt and 1 with Syria. Several years later, the United States helped to broker a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel and a framework agreement for dealing with the Palestinian issue at Camp David. 10 years later, the United States helped to bring about the Madrid Peace Conference, which as I suggested on Friday night, broke several important, at least procedural, taboos in the Middle East. 1994, the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty, and the subsequent diplomacy. The United States also, during this period, interacted with Arab states in a way that we had not been able to do so before. Our relationship with Egypt after the 1952 Egyptian Revolution was one of the most troubled relationships we had anywhere in the world, because Nasser, the first president of Egypt to emerge seriously after the revolution in 52, had in mind a role for Egypt which ran counter to American strategic interests in defining the world according to friends and foes. This was the Cold War, after all, the period in which it could be said you were either with us or you were against us. And Nasser, along with, you remember, Tito from Yugoslavia and Nehru from India and Suharto from Indonesia, were trying to form a third way, what became known as the non-aligned movement. And for the United States, in many respects, much more than for the Soviet Union, that was an unacceptable alternative pathway. And so it put us at odds with Nasser. And Nasser was at odds with the United States. He didn't like anything we were doing. He didn't like the idea that we were trying to form strategic alliances that would represent a kind of bulwark against Soviet encroachment. He didn't like the fact that when he asked us for assistance, we, as would be natural, tied it to certain conditions. He wanted a kind of unconditional love from the United States, which was not available. And we had an exceedingly troubled relationship with Egypt all the way until 1973, when it flipped. And within 5 years, we not only had helped Egypt and Israel broker a peace treaty, but we established the foundations of what was to become one of the most interesting strategic relationships that we had anywhere in the world. Because each of us had objectives to be gained in that relationship, which we found we could gain mutually by working together. It's been said that Egypt, in fact, negotiated peace with Israel to get to the United States, that its objective was not necessarily peace with Israel, but peace with the United States. But Egypt understood in order to get that relationship with the United States, it needed to make peace. And it did so. And it has observed that peace, even though it's been a cold peace. The security relationship between Egypt and Israel has been one of the most stable of any relationship in the world, despite the fact that Israeli tourists are not welcome anymore in Egypt, despite the fact that there are some but limited business relationships between the two countries, besides the fact that Egypt still yells at Israel a great deal in international fora. In security terms, in fact, until the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, there was not only no fence along the Egyptian-Israeli border, there were virtually no Israeli troops along that border. It was a calm, unguarded border in which there were no security incidents. In other words, the critical part of the Egyptian-Israeli treaty that the Egyptians knew they had to maintain in order to get to the relationship with the United States was maintained. For the United States, we had several critical strategic objectives of our own. Number one, we wanted to concretize Egypt's turn away from the Soviet Union and into the American camp. And what that required in military terms was weaning the Egyptians off of Soviet doctrine, training, and arms, and substituting American doctrine, training, and arms. And if one doubts whether or not that was doable, you can see one of the milestones achieved in the course of this progress just 10 years later, when, in the aftermath of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the United States marshaled an international coalition to push Iraq out of Kuwait. Right next to our forces, ready to invade Kuwait in order to dislodge Iraq, were 2 Egyptian divisions. We transported them because Egypt doesn't have what's called lift to move its own forces that distance. But a mechanized infantry division and a mechanized armor division fought alongside the United States almost interoperably in that war. Now, if I were a military person, I would confide in you that they didn't fight all that well, because they were only 10 years into this total change of their training doctrine and assimilation of weapons. But in terms of what they did do, occupying space that was critical along the front line, representing symbolically an Arab alliance with the West in a war directed against an Arab state, one can't measure that in easily definable terms. Critical for the United States and the international coalition to have Egypt, and I would add Syria, at that time fighting alongside of us against an Arab foe. We had a second objective in Egypt as this relationship grew in the late 70s and early 80s. And that was to build an Egyptian economy that would become, over time, self-sustaining. When we started our relationship with Egypt in 1977-78, it was essentially bankrupt. And in fact, you can now read conversations that Sadat had with American leaders at that time, they've now been declassified, in which he tells American presidents and secretaries of state that he has no foreign reserves, he has no money. The economy is essentially non-existent. Egyptian infrastructure had long ago collapsed. Sheila and I were first stationed in Cairo in 1979. I was a relatively junior officer. When I left our house in the morning in Maadi, 10 miles south of our embassy in Cairo, I had no contact with Sheila for the rest of the day because there were no telephone systems that worked. We knew there was going to be an electricity blackout at least once a day. We didn't know how long it would last because the electricity system, the power grid, was in such poor condition. Business people, and this is true, were saving up their phone calls until Friday when they would fly to Cyprus to make phone calls and then return to Cairo on Saturday or Sunday to do work. Buildings in Cairo were literally collapsing because of the infiltration of groundwater, because the sewer and water system was so broken that it simply was seeping into buildings, and the buildings themselves were becoming almost like suction or straws, drawing the water into the foundation and up the walls. So for the United States, our relationship with Egypt, as we intended it, was not only to have a military ally, but in a sense to make Egypt a showcase of what a relationship with the United States could be. And over the course of the next 30 years, with a very large investment of American resources, we largely accomplished this purpose. After the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003, the Americans put out an international tender for the telecommunications contract in Iraq. It was won by an Egyptian company, because by that time, in other words, 20 years after our relationship started with Egypt, not only was the Egyptian telephone system working, but it was advanced enough to win an international tender and now provide telecommunications service in Iraq. Sewers and water systems were built throughout Cairo, and buildings were now more stable. The Egyptian electricity grid not only was strengthened, but for a short period of time, Egypt became a net exporter of electricity, particularly to Jordan. In other words, this was a success of an American investment. We had as our second objective creating a significant economic base for Egypt to live, and it largely succeeded. Our third objective, perhaps less successful, was to see whether or not Egypt could also become a political success. And as you will now see, this takes us to the next phase of our discussion, the 2011 revolution. Because in that respect, the United States did not succeed. We had a significant dialogue with the Egyptians over the years. I can't tell you how many times in my own conversations with President Mubarak and Egyptian leaders, there was table pounding over the question of democratic practices, freedoms, the rights of citizens, civil society. To some extent, we had a dialogue. To a large extent, it was a dialogue of the deaf. Because President Mubarak and his leadership cadre continued to see the threat to not just their own rule, but to the future of Egypt, coming from an underground, fundamentalist, radical Islamist movement. So much so that we had now heard conversations that Mubarak had literally on the day that he left Cairo to go to Sharm el-Sheikh in 2011, leaving power, in which he reportedly said to an Israeli official who called him, "You will now see what I meant in warning the world about the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood." Now, some of this, of course, was using the bogeyman of Islamism to scare people into accepting emergency rule. In other words, the rule of an authoritarian, autocratic leader. But as we're going to talk about in a moment, there was also a grain of truth in it, which Mubarak understood in some respects far better than the rest of us, what his own society was all about, and the degree to which that underground fundamentalist radical Islamist movement both existed, but also existed in large part as a counterpoint to the very policies that Mubarak was carrying out in order to prevent the rise of the Islamist movement. So you have, in this period, significant American investment in these issues which are evolving over this period of time in the peace process, in a strategic relationship with the most important and populous Arab country. And you have the beginning of what can only be called a comfort level on the part of American foreign policymakers that we were doing okay. Because these policies persisted throughout Republican and Democrat administrations. They persisted through Reagan and Bush and Clinton and Bush and now Obama, at least into the beginning of the Obama administration. Why then would I suggest, as I did at the outset, that we may be at another one of those turning points, as we were in 1973, and we may be at a point where in some years we will look back at this period, maybe not today, but this period and say, you know, this was a period in which trends and certain forces were coming to an end, and we should have been smart enough to see different trends and forces emerging. And I would suggest in this context that we look at this issue through three prisms of ongoing American interests in this region. The first is what the realist school of foreign policy would call American strategic interests. If you strip away the emotions and you strip away the love affairs we have with various countries or leaders, the fact is that we have strategic interests in this region, and in some respects they haven't changed much over the years. Until we become, I don't think we'll ever be self-sufficient in energy, but until we become less reliant upon foreign energy, and until our allies elsewhere in the world become less reliant on foreign energy, the energy that is found in the Middle East, oil and gas, remains a prime strategic interest of the United States. So much so that we continue to provide, almost unilaterally, the security for the export of oil and gas from the Persian Gulf, even though we draw less and less of our own energy from the Persian Gulf. We are paying several $100 million a year, apart from the expenditures in Iraq and Afghanistan, to secure the export of energy from that region, even though much of it now is going to China, Korea, India, and Japan. And the reason we do it is twofold. Number one, we don't want China and Korea and India and Japan in the Persian Gulf. And so the presence of our Navy represents a kind of defense mechanism against the intrusion, in our view, of other navies. But we also do it because the stability of the international energy market is a critical national interest of the United States. And too much fluctuation one way or the other would create instability, not just in energy, but also in economic markets. So energy has been a major strategic interest of the United States before, and it remains so now. Secondly, we have political interests. Clearly, a political interest is our relationship with the State of Israel, which, even though there are small hills and small valleys, has been one of the most stable relationships between a large power and a small power, I think, in the history of international relations. I think I can be challenged on that question, but it's at least a debatable proposition. Small powers and large powers don't normally get along very well because they're small powers and large powers. They're different interests. And yet we in Israel have found a way to largely deal with some very different priorities, and we've developed a relationship that continues to grow and to blossom even when we are not agreeing on some fundamental issues. You take the first Obama administration, the first term, where clearly there was a problem between the president and the prime minister of Israel. They didn't like each other, they didn't trust each other, and you could see it. It wasn't just behind closed doors. And yet, by all measurable calculations, the U.S.-Israeli relationship grew in a variety of ways during that period. That's because that's what we do. We find ways to cooperate, whether it's on anti-missile systems or whether it's on additional assistance for Israeli domestic concerns. It's what the United States does to help Israel, a major political concern. And you can follow those political concerns around the region where the United States does have an interest, even if we have differences of view, with a number of moderate Arab states, Saudi Arabia and the 5 Gulf states, North African states, the Kingdom of Jordan. We also have interests in what can be called a lot of things, but I'd call it an idealism version of democracy growth in the Middle East. This was not invented by George W. Bush. He gave it certain names. He called it a freedom agenda and so forth. But we've had a strain in our foreign policy going back even before Woodrow Wilson, but certainly brought to the fore by Wilson, that suggests that we have an exceptional role and an exceptional character in international relations, which, in a sense, motivates us to help others move towards democratic governance and the building of democratic culture. And so even though we are dealing for lots of other reasons with dictators and autocrats and authoritarian governments, we can live with the fact that we want to see those governments and those societies change because that's in our nature. Not that we want to replicate little Americas around the world, but we see people living better under freedom and under democratic rule than they do under many other forms of political governance. And so the continuity of American interests, be they strategic, political, or idealistic, have not changed much. But in 3 test cases, and with this I'll conclude the formal remarks and we can turn to your questions. In 3 test cases on our agenda today, these strategic, political, and idealistic interests are going to be tested to their extreme. Let me deal with each of them very briefly. First, of course, is Egypt, to which I've devoted some attention already, but is worth a little bit more attention. Sheila and I lived there for 8 years, so at a minimum, it's of concern to us having friends and acquaintances that go back for a number of years. I have found the Egyptian Revolution to be a fascinating case study for a lot of reasons. First of all, revolutions are messy. We know that from our own experience. We know it from the French experience, the Iranian experience. Revolutions are not one-step processes. They go through a variety of stages. Academics have tried to characterize these stages, whether it's Crane Brinton, who focused on the American Revolution, or Ted Robert Gurr, who has a whole theory about what precipitates the move from stability to revolution. The point is that it is not unusual, and therefore not surprising, that the Egyptian revolution has been messy. And it's now in what I've tended to term maybe the 5th round of a 15-round heavyweight bout. We are not in the late stages of this adventure. The first stage was the excitement of a populist uprising to a large extent, by liberal forces within Egypt who had not planned a revolution, but found themselves in the middle of a revolution because they had a very strong ally that they didn't know they had until the effort started, and that was the Egyptian military. The Egyptian military understood almost from the beginning of the 2011 uprising that Mubarak's days were numbered. And even though they were the bulwark of Mubarak's regime, Egypt has been a Praetorian regime since 1952, the person of Mubarak was less important to the military than the system which they needed to protect. And so almost from the beginning, it was clear that the military was ready to dump Mubarak overboard. I say this because there's been arguments. We've heard it in our own country, we've heard it from our Saudi friends, we've heard it from our Israeli friends, that we pushed Mubarak under the bus. Absolute nonsense. I'm out of government. I've been out of government since 2005, but during this period, I was in constant contact with our policymakers. And I will tell you that we were 24 hours behind every move of the Egyptian military during that period. Every move of the Egyptian military. And so, yes, we did reach a decision that it was time first for Mubarak to appoint a vice president, which he had refused to do until then. But the military had already done that. They had told Mubarak 24 hours earlier that it was necessary. And we reached a decision that Mubarak had to rule out the accession to the presidency of his son. The military had already told Mubarak that they would not countenance Gamal Mubarak's becoming president. And when we finally reached the decision that it was time for Mubarak to retire, the military had already delivered that message. Now, that doesn't absolve the United States of responsibility for whatever we may have done, but it suggests that there's a far more nuanced set of circumstances underway in Egypt than I think our Washington policymakers and our pundit community have been willing to understand and to admit. The Egyptians, since the revolution, have been in a prolonged state of constitutional debate. We and our media have tended to look at demonstrations on the streets and the fighting in Tahrir Square, but in some respects that is the outward manifestation of what's really happening in that society, which is a basic debate about who they are. Are they a society that will eternally be governed by a privileged military elite that allows non-military forces to be a surface-level governing force, which is essentially what we have today? You have an interim government which is largely civilian, but they're sitting on this foundation of military control. Or will it be something else? Will the liberal forces in that society who brought about the demonstrations in 2011 figure out how to actually come up with a political program which will then allow them to seriously contest an election and join in the governance of the country as a force to be reckoned with that wants to advance the freedoms and the rights and civil society and the things that over time will build democratic culture? And that, I would argue, is what's happening in Egypt today. It's that debate. It's not the fighting that goes on. Yesterday, I think 5 people were killed in Egypt, and today is supposed to be an even more serious set of demonstrations in the country. That's the surface level manifestation of this cosmic debate under the surface about what this country is going to be. And you can see some of it not just in the demonstrations, but you can see it also in the constitutional reform efforts. Because they're taking seriously the idea of constitution drafting. You know, we look back on our own experience, and we're so proud of what happened in Philadelphia. You know, we used to visit with friends in Boston, and 1776 was one of the things we watched all the time, the musical. We're very proud of that experience, of how our founding fathers came together and thought hard and long about who we are and what we're supposed to be and how we relate to each other. In some respects, the Egyptians are doing the same thing. And they are debating the relationship of Islam to society, of Islam to legislation, of responsibilities and rights of people relative to their government. I don't think what's going to emerge from this is going to be full-blown democracy. So I'm not suggesting that they will have the same success that we had in 1776 in the short period ahead. But watching them wrestle with this suggests that there is at least a possibility over time of something quite different emerging in Egypt. And for the United States, then, this represents a challenge that's quite different from what we had in 1979 or 1973. We still have an interest in Egypt's maintaining its relationship with Israel. The treaty between these two countries is the cornerstone of everything we do in the Middle East. So far, so good. But in order to maintain our strategic relationship with Egypt, a lot of the old stuff has to be cast overboard. We can't buy that support anymore simply by dumping in more tanks and more airplanes and more weapons. We have to find a more nuanced way of dealing with this country, which has focused so much of its attention on self-pride that it almost has become a rallying cry for everything that they're doing. And we can talk about this further. Second test case, Syria. I think what we saw in the past 6-8 weeks is the clarity of American policy and the lack of clarity of the articulation of that policy. What do I mean by that? Barack Obama has been absolutely clear, and his reading of the American people has been absolutely clear in saying that there are no circumstances today which warrant American military intervention in the Syrian civil war. He has just failed to explain that well. So that when the first opportunity presented itself for a decision to be taken, which was the admission finally after 4 or 3 previous chemical weapons attacks, when the administration finally said, yes, there has been a chemical weapons attack, it was a moment in which the clarity of the underlying policy and the lack of clarity of the articulation of policy became most manifest. Because what the president said on that Saturday when he gave his talk to the American people was basically, this is not our fight. It's horrible that 100,000 people have been killed. It's really horrible. And we're trying to do with the international community what we can do to relieve humanitarian distress. And we're in fact doing a few other things. We're providing some assistance to the opposition and some training. But he essentially said, it's not our fight. The Syrian people are going to have to figure that out. What became our concern was the violation of an international norm in the area of weapons of mass destruction. And to deal with that concern, the president then said, consistent with views that he had expressed as far back as 2003 when he opposed the war in Iraq, a president has the right to use force in this case, but the president would be best advised to consult with the Congress. So he left himself an out, a possibility of unilaterally using force, but he carried out a condition of policy that he has been very clear about, whether you agree with it or you don't agree with it. So the concern that people have had about American policy, weakness and uncertainty, I think is misguided. And I don't say this because I'm a cheerleader for this policy. I think the president and the administration have done an exceedingly poor job of explaining to the American people what is our interest in Syria. We have interests. I don't believe, and here I agree with the administration, that those interests should carry us over into military intervention. But what is our interest at all? We don't intervene in a lot of civil wars around the world. You take the entire continent of Africa, we don't intervene almost at all in what's happening in Africa, including in genocides in Africa, which I think is wrong. But in Syria, it's now headlines, it's news, it's the focal point of so much attention. We, the American people, deserve an explanation. Why is it that we care at all? Why is it front page in the Boston Globe, New York Times, Washington Post? But we also then, as American people, need to understand that this administration, again, whether we oppose it or support it, has reached a conclusion that the Syrian conflict is not our conflict. And we are not going to intervene to change the basic dynamic of that civil war. Now, the reality is, as we've tried to examine in a number of what are called Track 2 activities, in other words, non-governmental activities in which members of the Syrian opposition have met in Europe with outsiders. I've been part of some of these. The fact of the matter is that even if we were gung-ho to intervene, I'm not sure that we actually know what to do when we intervene. Because the Syrian opposition, I'm trying not to be too caustic, is not very serious. They've done a relatively decent job in holding on to some territory, but they have become so fractionated that you now have an opposition that is actually composed of small groups of militia that constantly are becoming smaller groups of militia, almost like block leaders. You know, it started out regional, and then it went to village, and now it's down to the block level. As soon as a leader finds that he can develop a cadre of 100 fighters, he breaks away from whatever group he had been part of. There's also, as we know, a growing element of very radical, Al-Qaeda-like radical Islamic opposition. And so you have the concern that you intervene to defeat the horrific policies of Bashar al-Assad, and you pave the way for the coming to power of even worse people in the aftermath. One of the motivations, I might add, for Russian policy in this period. They've been very clear that they don't particularly like Assad one way or the other, but they will not allow that regime to be toppled because of the concern that what will happen in Syria is like what happened in Egypt and Tunisia. In other words, the fundamentalists will come to the fore, and they're concerned about their own southern regions, which are populated by large Muslim populations. So in Syria, if we look at this triad of strategic, political, and idealistic interests of the United States, yes, we have an interest in Syria becoming a functioning democracy. But in practical terms, our strategic interests in Syria are not that serious. We've lived without an alliance with Syria for 40 years. We've done pretty well. We can live without an alliance with Syria for another 40 years. And we don't have a particularly strong political relationship with Syria. And the likelihood of a Syrian-Israeli peace process in the near future over the Golan Heights, they say it's slim to none and slim has left town. It's not going to happen soon. For those of you who may have children in the Golan Heights, I think they're probably pretty safe for the time being. And then we turn to our third test case, Iran. It's when I teach Middle East politics at Princeton, I don't want to say I have a lot of fun teaching Iran, but I'm interested in what I teach because it's a fascinating set of case studies about the changing nature of relationships. We had opportunities after World War II to be Iran's best friend when the British and the Russians, which had occupied Iran during the war, were still confronting Iranian pretensions towards democratic rule, and they looked to us to help them out. and in fact by the early 1950s had elected an oddball democratic leader named Mohammad Mossadegh. And oddball is a nice way of characterizing him. He used to meet foreign visitors in his pajamas in his bedroom. Very strange man, accused by some of being a Marxist, probably not. And we decided in 1953 that we would go along with the Brits and we would overthrow this democratically elected president of Iran. Bringing the Shah back to Iran, he had run away in the period preceding the revolution. We brought him back, and we helped him build one of the most ruthless secret services anywhere in the world, SAVAK. So we enjoyed a 25-year, quote-unquote, strategic relationship with Iran. And in fact, if you recall, the Nixon Doctrine in 1970 was largely a way of concretizing this strategic relationship, because we, at that time, being bogged down in Vietnam, but understanding that we had interests in the Middle East that required care and feeding, basically outsourced our care and feeding to the Iranians and to some extent the Israelis, in a doctrine that said we will support regional countries who are prepared to carry out policies that are consistent with our own. I don't remember the exact words, but this was the intent of the Nixon Doctrine. So our coup that we pulled off in 1953 bought us 25 years of a very important strategic relationship. But it also bought us the internal, maybe not eternal, but long-standing enmity of those who were to come to power in 1979, the Islamists, the Ayatollah Khomeini and the Islamic Republic of Iran. You remember the hostage crisis, the degree to which the raw anger of Iranians towards us and us towards Iran came into full view. And so we have had a very troubled relationship since 1979 with Iran. And it's been a period in which the Iranians have engaged in not just the rhetoric of opposition to us, but they've carried it out in action. They've carried out terrorism, international terrorism, responsible for the bombing of the Jewish Cultural Center in Argentina, largely responsible for arming Hezbollah. Hezbollah was considered by Dick Cheney in the 1990s to be the A-team of terrorism, as before Al-Qaeda came into being. They have opposed vehemently efforts to expand the peace process. In fact, on the day that we were meeting in Madrid in 1991 to launch the Madrid Peace Conference, on that same day there was an anti-peace conference in Tehran designed to marshal support for those who were opposed to peace. And they have reviled publicly and in a lot of other ways, not just the big Satan, us, but the little Satan, the State of Israel, including under the recent president, Ahmadinejad, such issues as denying the Holocaust, as we know, and basically calling for the destruction of what they call the Zionist regime. So there was not a lot of romantic notions of reconciliation during these past several decades. And then all of a sudden, something happened just a couple of weeks ago. And it happened all of a sudden, but the seeds of this have been planted by a sustained effort by the United States to do at least three things. Number one, to keep on the table an option of using military force to stop the Iranians from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And you know the rhetoric. President Bush, President Obama have said consistently that there is no option taken off the table. Sometimes spokespeople of the administration have been a little more affirmative in suggesting that the use of force is possible. Secondly, we have been able to introduce sanctions, and they are biting sanctions that have had a significant impact on the Iranian economy. And third, at least in the Obama administration, not in the Bush administration, but at least in the Obama administration, we have held out the prospect of diplomatic engagement without much hope, frankly. In the first Obama term, in fact, we had a total of, I think, 5 meetings, none of them bilateral. They were all involving the 5 permanent members of the Security Council in Germany on one side of the table and the Iranians on the other side of the table. But it held out the prospect that there might be a diplomatic pathway to a different kind of relationship between us. The Iranians, in what we hope is their wisdom, elected a president a couple of months ago who is committed in his own way to the same possibility, and I will keep underlining possibility. Because even though Hassan Rouhani has a history of radical politics within Iran, radical politics in Iran is mainstream politics in Iran. His campaign slogans and the appeal that he had to the Iranian people was, in part, to change the nature of Iran's relationship with the United States and the West. Now, it's fair to be entirely skeptical and largely cynical. And so when Benjamin Netanyahu comes to the UN this year, you remember last year he brought that poster of the red line, the little bomb. It was interesting. When he comes to the United Nations this year and is skeptical, it's entirely within reason. Because we don't know whether or not this is a game that Rouhani is playing. And the concern about a game is not just that you walk into a negotiation and you try it and it fails, but it takes time for it to fail. And while it's failing, Iran is getting closer and closer to reaching the tipping point of being able to build that bomb. So it is perfectly reasonable to be skeptical and even cynical. But it is also perfectly reasonable to explore quickly and with care whether or not there is an opening here for a different relationship between our two countries. Now, I'd only suggest in closing that we think about this not only in the narrow terms of Iran's nuclear program, which is by far the most important issue on the agenda as far as we're concerned, and certainly for the State of Israel. Because if you only look at it in terms of Iran's nuclear program, our ability to negotiate a different outcome is limited. It's limited because it almost becomes a zero-sum game. To the extent that we gain Iran's concurrence to reduce or eliminate its program, they end up with less or no program at all. When in fact they assert the right to have at least a civilian program, including, under terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the right to enrich uranium. They have that right under the international treaty to which they've subscribed. But if you widen the lens aperture and look at the totality of issues on our agenda, including but not limited to the nuclear issue, but including Iranian interests in Afghanistan and Iraq, which we largely helped them over the years. The Iranians actually helped us in 2001 when we invaded Afghanistan. They helped us considerably. Our response at that time was to call them part of the axis of evil, which they didn't take kindly to. But the reality was that they knew we had helped them achieve a weakened Afghanistan and then ultimately a weakened Iraq, which in terms of their immediate national security interests are what bothers them. They're their neighbors. So we have interests that actually align with theirs. We have interests in diminishing, if not ending, Iran's opposition to the peace process and diminishing, if not ending, Iran's baseless hatred for the State of Israel. And we have interests, of course, in diminishing, if not ending, Iran's support for international terrorism, in particular Hezbollah. So when you widen the lens aperture of a diplomatic agenda, it gives diplomats something to play with. Carefully, with great caution, maybe not a lot of optimism, but it's something that we have not had since 1979, and something I would suggest suggests to us that we may be at a moment when not just the Iranian issue, but the Iranian issue today, the peace process that I talked about Friday night, and the chemical weapons issue in Syria offer unprecedented diplomatic opportunities for the United States and unprecedented diplomatic challenges for our policymakers and our diplomats. Thank you.
So yesterday we had to, Daniel was continually being prompted to talk about the things that he just spoke of, and he kept saying, "You'll have to ask me that tomorrow." It's now tomorrow. So I'm hopeful there are a range of questions you'd like to pose. Let's hold on to this like that. Let's go ahead.
Thank you for your very fascinating remarks. Would you speak about Turkey? I thought that might be one of your three, but a country that to which the U.S. has had a good relationship, and Israel as well, and seems to be shifting now.
Look, in one respect, I alluded to Turkey quite directly in what I call the rise of the periphery. What happens in Turkey and Turkish relations with the Middle East have now become far more important than they've been at any time in the past since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, in fact, and the First World War. In recent years, Turkey was able to become defined by us and the rest of the world as what was known as a pivotal state. Because if you look at Turkey's geopolitical situation, it sits literally at the crossroads and the nexus of Europe, the Middle East and Mediterranean, and Central Asia. And so therefore it becomes a critical place in which politics and diplomacy play themselves out. The West has been able to maintain Turkey as a part of the NATO alliance, but the West has not been wise enough, in my view, to find a way to bring Turkey into the European Union, even though over time Turkey tried to adhere to many of the conditions put forward by the EU for membership. The EU kept moving the goalposts, largely leading to Turkey's belief that the EU was not ready for an Islamic country to become part of the Christian Europe family. So the wisdom of Turkey and NATO, the lack of wisdom of Turkey not in the EU, over time prompted Turkish policymakers, in particular its foreign minister, whose name I still have trouble pronouncing, Davutoglu, to develop, when he was an academic, the idea of a Turkish foreign policy which he declared to be one of no problems with neighbors. In other words, he felt that Turkey could have relations with all of its neighborhood to its own advantage. And if you look at Turkey in the period from maybe 2000 to just a couple of years ago, you almost can mark the end of that period with the Mavi Marmara, the ship that's tried to sail to Gaza until it was stopped. Turkey largely succeeded in this policy. It had a very significant relationship with the State of Israel, as we know. Its trade relations with the Middle East exploded in positive terms. It maintained its ties with Europe, including improving some of those ties. And it became a factor in Central Asia, including a diminishing of its tensions with Armenia and building up relationships with Azerbaijan and others as you go into the stands. And Turkey then became one of the, even though we referred to them as the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the emerging economic powerhouses. In the period up until a couple of years ago, you had to say the BRIC plus Turkey, because they were part of that fraternity. And then things started to go south. First of all, the Turks reacted the way they reacted to the Mavi Marmara. and the Turkish-Israeli relationship crumbled. Parts of it stayed intact for a while, and then it crumbled. As Syria began to disintegrate in the last couple of years, Turkish security interests became impacted. There are upwards of 1 million Syrian refugees now in southern Turkey, representing a drain on Turkish resources and also a security concern. Its relations with Arab countries soured as a result of the so-called Arab Spring, when Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey presumed to suggest that the Turkish model of an Islamic democracy might work in a place like Egypt. The Egyptians, both the military and the Islamists, basically said, mind your own business. Because to them, hearing a Turkish prime minister say that reminded them of the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire. And they don't want Turkish involvement. So Turkey today is a wounded brick and a wounded pivotal state. It still has inherent strengths and still exercises some degree of influence in this region. But in many respects, until it can figure out how to rebuild its ties to Israel, and the ball is now in Turkey's court, because Israel did meet the Turkish condition of an apology of sorts and of some kind of restitution, some kind of payment. The ball is now in the Turkish court, and the Turks are not handling this well. There's an interview yesterday or today with Abdullah Gül, the president of Turkey, in which he says, well, they didn't do enough, moving the goalposts. You know, we want them to do X, they did X, well, we really wanted X plus. So the Turks have to figure out what it is they want and how they're going to achieve it. Until they do, what I call this wounded pivotal state, I think will continue for the time being.
It was a pleasure to listen to you.
Oh,
I wonder if you have any influence in Washington.
I'm trying to have influence in Boston at the moment. I don't know about Washington. Oh, look, having served for almost 30 years in government, there are severe limits to the tolerance level of policymakers to listen to anybody from the outside. They pay much more attention to the pundits in the Washington Post and the New York Times because you have to answer questions from journalists. You don't have to answer questions from academics. So, I think realistically the answer is, all of us try to come up with ideas and to keep in touch with friends and former colleagues. But realistically, we are you. I am you, part of, John Q. Public. And hopefully, at some point, somebody might listen. But I don't go to bed at night believing that they're going to adopt my policy the next day. If they do, I'll let you know.
I have two questions. First one, I appreciate your discussion of the analysis of Syria vis-a-vis Barack Obama, and I understand it. The problem I don't understand is his inconsistency vis-a-vis Libya. We invaded Libya. Did we invade Libya because it had oil, and that's why we're not there? So that's question number one. Question number two is, I don't understand why Iran is so anti-Semitic and anti-Israel for a non-Arab country. They're vocal. Ahmadinejad is doesn't believe the Holocaust existed, et cetera, et cetera. I could understand being with their brethren, but it's not really their brothers.
Let me start with Iran, and then I'll do Libya second. If, as I described, the United States had built this strategic relationship with the Shah for 25 years after 1953, coming in behind the United States and playing a very instrumental role with both the Iranian military and intelligence services was the State of Israel. Israel never had an embassy, per se, in Iran, but it had a very large delegation, including very senior military, intelligence, and political diplomatic officials. And so when the revolution took place, we became the big Satan and they became the little Satan, not for inherently anti-Semitic reasons, but because of being identified as one of the two major forces that kept the Shah and Savak in power all those years. And in that respect, there's no justification for this attitude, but it also isn't wrong. In other words, they've gone overboard in being opposed to those who were responsible, but the fact is that we and the Israelis were responsible. We to a much larger extent, but the Israelis by far the second most important outside power in Iran during those years. You remember it was a period in which the city of Eilat grew as a result of oil that Israel was getting from Iran. The Iranians would always say, what oil? And the Israelis would never admit that it was coming from Iran, but that's where Israel got its oil from. So, again, I don't want to suggest that it's justified, but when it's explained, it's part of that revolutionary mentality. Libya is an interesting question because, in a sense, we don't know for sure yet, but Libya is a test case of whether or not an emerging concept in international law will have been validated by Libya or destroyed by Libya, and that is the principle of the responsibility to protect. If you go back to the Security Council resolution which authorized the use of force in Libya, it was predicated on this principle of the responsibility to protect. You remember Benghazi was coming under tremendous pressure from Gaddafi's forces, and it looked like there was going to be a massacre in Benghazi, and therefore the Security Council acted under Chapter 7 and said, we have, as the international community, a responsibility to protect the people of Libya. The reason I question whether or not this is going to be a success or failure is not only because Libya itself hangs in the balance. It's a country facing great challenges. You probably read in the paper, we in fact operated in Libya over the past 24 hours. Our counterterrorism teams went in and captured someone we believe responsible for terrorism against us. We, in a sense, violated the sovereignty of Libya to carry out this policy. And it's possible Libya may end up going down that drain. But you also go back to the initial actions of military force. If we were operating on the basis of the responsibility to protect, then it's questionable if it was the right move to have the first military action be an attempt to assassinate Gaddafi. And that's what we did. The first thing we tried to do was to assassinate Gaddafi by air. Now, political military figures would suggest to you, had we succeeded, it might have ended the need for military intervention. You know, the argument that was made in Iraq in 2003, if that first volley had killed Saddam and several of his top leaders, you wouldn't have to invade. Maybe. But once you've done that and you didn't succeed, then what you've done is to take this principle of international law and basically make it irrelevant. So if you now, for example, go to Moscow and say to them, why won't you support a Security Council resolution for international involvement in Syria, they point to Libya. And they say, well, we may think that we're authorizing the use of force for purpose A, but NATO will use it for purpose B and C and D. In other words, for NATO's interests. So it's a question mark whether or not this thing's going to end up the right way.
I think that, for me, I have a glimmer of hope that somehow this hardworking diplomacy and political effort will work out in the end. But I'm still very troubled by the position of religion in this whole affair, which you didn't really touch on too much. And it seems to me it won't stop. The troubles won't stop until reasonable Muslims say to the ultras, enough, and reasonable Jews say to the ultras, enough.
Well, let me stick with the reasonable Muslims today. And if Steve has any influence and I'm invited back next year, I'll talk about reasonable Jews at that point. The reality is that we don't hear about reasonable Muslims in this country, and there are a lot of them in the Middle East. their voices get drowned out by the unreasonable ones because that's what unreasonable people do. Their objective is to drown out the voices of moderation and to carry out policies of radicalism and extremism. What you've seen on the ground in Egypt since July 3rd, when the military intervened, was not only a military action. For those of you who follow this closely, I refuse to call it a coup, because if you call it a coup, it kicks in American law on sanctioning Egypt. So I'm going to hold back on the word coup. You saw military action for its own reasons, but you also saw liberal society in Egypt support the military because it was the military able to push back against radical Islam. So you have this anomaly which, frankly, I don't think people understand this well in Washington. Why would the liberals in Egypt support the military, which over the years had been the bulwark of an authoritarian regime? It's because when you have one danger, which is the return to authoritarianism with the military, and you have another danger, which is the rise of Islamic politics under the guise of democracy, which we saw for a year in the Muslim Brotherhood, most of liberal society in Egypt chooses the military. And that's their way of manifesting what we're calling moderate Islam or reasonable Muslims. So in a sense, they work against their own interests because the military is not a democratic institution in Egypt and is not crazy about the idea of truly free elections and free market economy. But when your choice is not among nuances, but among a kind of black and white, I go with Muslim extremism, which we have seen over the course of the past year was pretty bad in Egypt, or I go with something like controlled politics under the military. Egyptians are voting with their feet and will vote in the next election to go with the latter. So I think the voices of what you called, what I forget, moderate Islam or reasonable Islam, are in fact being heard in a place like Egypt. And part of what's happening in Libya, part of what's happening in Tunisia. Tunisia is interesting because you had an election which in fact produced a coalition government. The Ennahda, which is the Islamist party, the Muslim Brotherhood of Tunisia, did not win a majority in the first election in Tunisia. And they have had to play politics in Tunisia much differently from the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which won every election it contested, but misunderstood why it won those elections. It thought it won the elections because it thought it was popular. It won the elections because everybody else was not popular. And it was a way of opposing Mubarak's policies and opposing the military and opposing the Mukhabarat. And then all of a sudden, when the population saw how bad that choice was, they said, all right, we're going to swing back in the other direction.
We have time for two more questions.
Thank you very much for your discussions. Very helpful in understanding the Middle East. I've grown up in Turkey, so I grew up at a time where Atatürk's laws were what we went by, and at this point, I'm very concerned about Erdogan's Islamic influence and his persecution of not just the military, but particularly the intellectuals and the minorities who are leaving day by day. And do you see Turkey turning to more of an Islamic nation down the road?
I think if the current trend continues, the answer is decidedly yes. What Erdogan has been smart enough to do is to do this gradually. And he did in 10 years what Morsi in Egypt tried to do in 1 year. And so by compressing the 10-year slide towards Islamism in Egypt in 1 year, Morsi showed his hand and ended up out of power. Erdogan has been much, much wiser and much more politically astute because he's done it quietly and he's done it over time, and he's done it to a point where the Turkish military, which used to play the role that the Egyptian military played on July 3rd, is no longer in a position to do so. Not only no longer in a position to do so, but he can arrest generals, and he can control the appointments in the general staff, which would be unheard of just 10 years before. So I don't say this out of admiration, other than the admiration of somebody who knows what he wants, but also knows that there are limits of how fast you can get to your objective. And Erdogan has understood those limits while keeping his eye very much on that ultimate goal. Now, he's out of power in, I don't know when the election is, within the year. He wants to become president, which is largely an honorific position. But, you know, you saw with Putin that you can turn an honorific position as prime minister into a stepping stone back into real power. And who knows what Erdogan will do behind the scenes in terms of controlling Turkish politics. So if we're back talking about this in 10 years, I think the answer is yes, Turkey will be much further down the road towards Islamism, especially if it's guided by an Erdogan-type leader who has the wisdom not to bite off too much at one time, but to take little chunks out of the liberal political system.
Last question. We'll start in the same family we started with, we'll finish with.
And luckily, the last question is not from Sheila, which I thought was going to happen.
I have an entirely different question, actually, from the other member of my family. What do you think the Obama administration can/will do? Do you think they have the power and the smarts? I haven't seen it, and I wondered if you can predict in relation to the Israeli peace process and also to Iran.
So you weren't there Friday night.
No, I wasn't, I'm afraid. So if you've already answered this, you can ignore my question and you can move on to someone else.
Yeah. Look, what I said Friday night on the peace process is that Secretary of State Kerry, with the backing of the President, had constructed, until the point at which the talks started, what I would consider to be a very sophisticated architecture of peacemaking. Up until that point, when an American leader talked about the peace process, he talked about, let's get to negotiations, as though the mere act of walking into a negotiating room was the goal. What Kerry did with bringing the Arab foreign ministers back into the picture with the Arab Peace Initiative, bringing General Allen into the picture to deal with Israeli security concerns, bringing the World Economic Forum's $4 billion program for state building in Palestine as part of the need to create a viable state and not a failed state. What Kerry did was to put together a strong enough foundation that gave me, reason to believe that if he could get to negotiations, they could at least be more sustainable than simply a one-off meeting. What I also said Friday night, though, is that in a sense the hard work now begins, because there are at least two factors at play which will determine success, in my view, will determine success or failure. Number one, whether or not these negotiations take place on the basis of serious terms of reference. There are no negotiations in the business world or in the diplomatic world that can operate without terms of reference, be they significant or insignificant, strong or weak. You have to have some modicum of agreement of what it is you're talking about and what your priorities are and what the relationship is among those issues. Right now, there are no terms of reference to these negotiations. If Kerry tries to negotiate terms of reference, failure. Because the parties can't agree on terms of reference in the same way they're going to have trouble agreeing on substance. So I suggested Friday night that we need to put forward the terms of reference. We need to put forward American parameters and say to the parties, this is where we understand you've come to until now. Within these parameters, we expect you to negotiate. These become terms of reference, number one. Number two, I suggested that if that is in fact done, the United States can't simply put that on the table, walk away, and say, see ya. We have to be very, very active, not as a substitute to the parties engaging between themselves. After all, they're the ones who have to make peace. But they have proved time and time again that they can get close on issues and can't reach over the remaining gap. So we have to be ready not to substitute for their direct engagement, but to be ready with creative, innovative ideas that help them bridge the gaps that they have defined they want to bridge, and that means a more active American role. So I think those are the two things we can be watching in the period ahead, and if they in fact start to happen, then the prognosis, I think, would be relatively good. Thank you very much.